On behalf of Radio Islam International, ASRI, Radio Al-Ansar, as well as Hilal TV and INX Prime, we welcome the listeners, we welcome the viewers, and we welcome the attendees to this very important program this evening here at the Nurul Islam Center. The audience primarily is an online one for this particular program. Radio Islam, Radio Al-Ansar, and I understand CI Broadcasting as well are carrying the transmission of this program live. Hilal TV is also doing a live broadcast of this particular interaction this evening, and so is INX Prime. Before we get into the actual discussion that was advertised on the topic of how to decide who to vote for, I have been tasked to say a few words with regards the objective behind this particular program and the importance of voting and engagement. Maulana Ibrahim Baam was actually supposed to have spoken about that, but due to another commitment that has come up, he is unable to make it, and I'll just share a few words in that regard before we get going with the actual program, and I will then outline what the format is for this evening. So, this election marks 30 years of democracy, and there has been much discussion and speculation as to how much has really been achieved in the last 3 decades and how much more could have been achieved since '94. There is a deep lament on the many missed and the many squandered opportunities in the last 30 years. And whilst at times it can be justifiably argued that proportionate acknowledgement is not given to what has been achieved over the last 30 years, especially considering the legacy of apartheid, there is no one that can deny that this election takes place at a time when corruption has crippled service delivery, when infrastructure is collapsing around us, when water and electricity provision is under serious strain, where coalition politics, in which a lot of people had hope, has unfortunately up to now manifested itself as only being about political power and access to resources rather than service delivery. It is citizens that have to do the work of government at local level. The electorate, generally speaking, is in a state of disillusionment, and I don't think anyone requires any elaboration on the challenges that we face as the country. But the question is, how are we reacting? And the more important question would be, how should we be reacting? So if we look at how we are reacting, there are those who are apathetic. They don't bother to register to vote. They haven't, or if they registered, they don't want to vote. There are those who feel that, what's the point? Nothing will change. So they have a very lackluster approach. And then there are those who argue, well, there's no party that I can totally agree with. So therefore, I don't feel any party is worthy of my vote. That, broadly speaking, is how people are reacting. The more important question is, how should we react? One is that we should never let our anger, our disappointment, our frustration, and our disillusionment cripple us. We need to move now from this constant state of lament and throwing pity party after pity party towards that which is action-orientated and solution-orientated. See, as a country, we saw worse during colonialism, during apartheid, and we overcame it. As believers, our religion reminds us that with the help of the Almighty, with sincerity, with courage, with determination, strategy, unity of purpose, we have in the past overcome far worse. We can overcome the challenges now, and we will overcome whatever challenges there are in the future. How? Well, I think 3 fundamental things need to change. Firstly, our mindset. And if the mindset changes, the narrative changes. And if the narrative changes, the overall approach towards our challenges and our problems would change. See, I think it's important that we understand as believers, and I say this specifically to the Muslim audience out there, that there's no dichotomy between being a good Muslim and a patriotic citizen. These 2 things are not mutually exclusive, right? To love your country is part of faith. Hubbul watani min al-iman. So this concern that has brought us here tonight, and we knew that tonight will be primarily about the online audience, but we have asked a few of our brothers and sisters to come here to create a bit of an interactive environment. The concern, the anger, and the frustration that has brought us here is because we love our country. And because we still have faith in this country. Some of us may have our ancestral lineage in some other part of the world, but this is the only home that we know. I mean, my kids are 6th generation South Africans. 6th generation South Africans. This country has given us a lot, a hell of a lot. Not only materially, but spiritually as well. So it's not time to give up on South Africa. It's time now for us to do our utmost for a better South Africa for all. And the point that I want to drive home is that our frustration, our disappointment shouldn't lead to disengaging. Because disengaging won't make things better. Sometimes when people say, what's the point of voting? Well, the automatic answer then would be, what's the point of not voting? What are you going to solve by disengaging from the process? In moments of adversity, you don't disengage, you improve the quality of your engagement. In moments of adversity, you've got to see how can we engage better. So it's our individual and collective prosperity, our material and spiritual success requires a stable and a politically conducive environment in our country. As Muslims, as Christians, as Jews, atheists, agnostic, no matter what you are, individually or collectively, materially or spiritually, you can't prosper if the climate is not politically stable and conducive. We have crime right in our mosques, right? We have people robbed when they're coming on the way to the masjid. Also, we have to understand that sometimes you may not totally agree from a religious perspective with a particular system. It doesn't mean you have to engage totally. It's not a, all or nothing kind of thing. When you give your vote to a candidate or to a party, it's a qualified endorsement. You're using your intellect, your God-given intellect, you apply your mind, and you see perceived benefit in a particular candidate or in a particular party. It doesn't mean you necessarily agree with every value of that party or every policy of that party, but you're looking to see that which candidate, in my considered view, will give South Africans their rights more so than others, or who will avert harm and loss more so than others. And this is what great scholars internationally like Mufti Taqi Usmani and others have been saying, that Islam is a complete way of life. Politics is not something alien to Islam. Politics may have a negative connotation because of the behavior of certain politicians, but politics in itself is part of the teachings, the comprehensive guidelines of our religion. So, coming to this particular election, there are those who want to engage, right? But they find themselves conflicted or they find themselves confused. And I think this is what makes this election all the more important. Many who want to vote, who are going to vote, don't know who to vote for, more so now than ever before. Either because a party that they previously voted for has let them down, or because of values. So within our community, we see many individuals who say, I can't bring myself to vote for a party that stands with Israel. Or I can't bring myself to vote for a party that does not call out a genocide. But then, do I give the ANC yet another chance? Notwithstanding the corruption and the lack of service delivery. Some are asking the question that, is there any merit in giving smaller parties your vote? Will it make a difference? Or do they just inevitably become lackeys of the bigger political parties? So these are some of the questions that are in the minds of people. And that's why we thought that it will be important to have this discussion. See, when we have a political debate, we don't even use this hall, we go next door because that place is full. There's an element of entertainment when it comes to debate, and political parties bring all of their supporters, or they bring big numbers of their supporters. And political debates have their place. We will have a political debate in the weeks to come. We're having one next week, Wednesday in Durban, and the following Wednesday we will have one in Joburg. It has its place. But the thing with political debates, what we thought, is that sometimes it becomes a little bit too much about rhetoric, point scoring, supporters of one party heckling, candidates or representatives of the other party, and the substantive issues get a bit lost. And with this election being as critical as it is, and with people being as conflicted and as confused as they are, we thought before we get to the political parties, let's rather have a more constructive discussion with experts in their field who will be able to shed some light on the performance, the policies and the visions of at least the major role players in our political spectrum. So they're not going to tell you who to vote for, right? That they're not going to do, but they will tell you how to go about making a considered decision. It's always important to make a considered decision, but in an election like this, as tight as it is, and where we are as a country, it's even more important now than it was at any time in the last 30 years to make a considered decision. So we have on the panel this evening, Nomboniso Gasa, with a long struggle history, a political commentator as well as a researcher. Angelo Fick, well-known political commentator and the head of research at ASRI. Kanita Hunter, award-winning journalist, author, and until recently politics editor at News 24. Kanita has just written a book, I think it's the 4th book, Who Will Rule South Africa? So that is a very appropriate book to be reading at the moment. My Kindle says I'm 80% done. I have this bad habit, I can't read one book from beginning to end at the same time. So I read multiple books, one next to my bedside, one in my office at home, one in the office at the radio station, a couple on the phone. So I found it very enlightening and very interesting, and I would strongly recommend that you read that book ahead of the elections. And joining us in a short while, he's just running a little late from another commitment, is Ibrahim Fakir, who's a lens boy from this area, from this masjid. Afzal, was he a student also? Yeah, okay. He's a political commentator and he's an instructor at ASRI. So I think I've shed some light in terms of the context of this particular discussion and why it's different to some of the political debates that we have. Also, the importance of us engaging and not disengaging, no matter how frustrated we may feel. There are 5 segments that we are going to be touching on. The first will be relating to electoral process. The second is governance and accountability. The third is society and its needs. The fourth is safety and security. And the fifth is South Africa in the region and world, or simply put, foreign policy. After which, we're going to have an interactive discussion. We'll give those in attendance first option. There is the WhatsApp number, 072-786-1548, for the listeners and the viewers to send through their questions. Maulana Ahmed Wajah will facilitate that and send it to the front. For those who are not very willing to speak or not very comfortable speaking in public, there will be paper that will be circulated. You can write down your questions and comments and send it to the front as well. So that is just a little bit of background. During the program, there's this tea at the back, coffee, and the bathrooms are in the back of the hall at the left. So, without further ado, I think we'll go into the first segment. What I'm going to do is just throw out some of the talking points under this particular topic, and then ask our experts to respond. And after that, if there's any follow-up questions from my side, I'll try and ask that before we move on. So, the first of the 5 areas that we're going to cover is about electoral process and how you go about voting. So now there's an extra ballot, right? So that's the first thing that we require clarity on. How many ballots and what does each ballot mean? And how do you approach? I mean, is it a simple thing of, okay, if I'm voting for this party, then same, what's going to happen? How do you understand the different ballots? The aspect of independent candidates that comes into place now for the first time. What do you need to consider when you're casting a national ballot versus a provincial or a regional ballot? And sometimes, the last aspect I will ask our guests to touch on, the importance of one vote and the importance of every vote. Because many times we all think, well, what difference will it make? I don't know what the weather is going to be like on that day, but if it's too hot or it's too cold, then let me just turn it into a public holiday, have a brunch, have a picnic, go do some shopping. I will see towards the evening, what difference is going to make whether I vote or I don't vote? And I think that is something that we need to touch on. So, Nomboniso, I think we'll give you the first bite of the cherry this evening. If you can commence, just briefly your thoughts around the electoral process and how to go about voting in specific relevance to this particular election.
I thought you would handle that.
Oh, you can start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah so much for this opportunity and for this important engagement tonight. I think that it is critically important for us to have discussions like these ahead of an important election. But more importantly, I think it shows a deep sense of responsibility that we have as Muslims and as South Africans in terms of valuing this very hard-fought right to vote, which is the most basic form of participation in a participatory democracy. It's not the most extreme form, it's the bare minimum. And so we enter the 2024 election with a slightly different electoral system. And this is because the Constitutional Court ruled that independent candidates are allowed now to contest elections. And in the Constitutional Court judgment, there was a instruction to the National Assembly to amend the Electoral Act. However, an overhaul essentially the electoral law as we know it. There was discussions around changing the electoral landscape so that we have a constituency-based system, so that there could be meaningful engagement. So this constituency directly elects X person and you can hold that person accountable. That didn't happen. What South Africa did, the Parliament did, was go for a middle ground. So essentially what has happened is the 400 seats that make up the National Assembly have been cut into half. So you have 200 that represent national vote and 200 what is termed as a regional vote. And that's why this year you'll have 3 ballots. A national ballot, a regional ballot, and then we obviously are also electing provincial representatives in the form of a provincial ballot. So that's the 3 ballots. When the ballots are given to voters on voting day, there's some different characteristics. One, each ballot will be a different color. So it will be marked national, provincial, regional. The national ballot will have 2 columns for the first time. And this is a very worrying thing because voters must only make 1 X on that ballot. If you make 2 X's on that ballot, it's a spoiled ballot. So there's 2 columns you must choose. In each column, there's 4 components. The picture of the political party leader, the logo, the name, the abbreviation ANC, and then in full African National Congress. So you can't really be confused. I know a few years ago, I think it was maybe 2014, the ANC said that they lost votes to the AIC because the AIC was ahead of it on the ballot. So the IEC is not taking anything for granted. Now, the important thing to know in terms of electoral process is that there are 70 political parties contesting provincial and national elections this year, and 11 independent candidates. We saw more political fragmentation in the 2019 election, but you are seeing a consistent trend of the hyper-fragmentation of the opposition, of which consistently since 94, a dozen or more, around 13, 14 political parties end up making it to the National Assembly. And so that has not been consistent. So from 70, 80 players, only about 12, 13, 14 actually make it in terms of representation. And when you look at who actually makes it, the bulk of the votes go to 3 parties, and the rest is sort of just, sort of small amounts of votes and small percentages. Now, the interesting fact for me is that essentially on the 29th of May 2024, 27 million South Africans are going to elect 870 representatives. That is 400 in the National Assembly and 470 in the provincial legislatures, plus or minus. Which means we are part of an interview panel, if you like, of these 870 candidates. That's not that many people. There are 14,900 plus people wanting to get 800 jobs. So just understand the level of political options. If the ballot was a menu or buffet, it would be endless options, right? And so the interesting bit in terms of why there's that many people vying for votes is multiple. There's multiple reasons why people stand for election. But I think that at the heart of it is the manifestation of a very carefully crafted electoral system and political system, which is a multi-party system. We are lucky as South Africans that we don't have 2 options like what you see in the US. That these options actually mean something. And so as I wrap up, Moulana, I think that a participatory democracy in a multi-party system comes with an added responsibility, because we cannot vote and come back 5 years later. What this means then is that we have to walk the road with our elected representatives, because we're not electing leaders. They're not our leaders. We are electing representatives. They are our workers. And that needs to be that fundamental change, is that they take their cue from us as the electorate. And so the important thing to realize is that as we decide who we're going to employ for the next 5 years, as simplistic as that may sound, I think that it is important to know that participation doesn't start and end with voting. And we will have to have conversations after the elections like this, where we map out what it is going to look like post-elections in terms of holding public representatives accountable, in terms of playing a more active role, a participatory role in lawmaking. And so I think that these type of forums where we engage so robustly before an election have to continue after an election. Shukran.
Angelo, would you like to add?
I'd like to cede to Ibrahim, who can explain exactly what those 3 ballots that Kanita mentioned will do, because 2 of them are for the National Assembly and 1 of them is for the provincial legislature. Ibrahim? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahman. Good to be back in Lens. You know you're not voting for any representative in Lens, right? Because there were people who I believe thought that they're voting for a local councillor or voting for someone from Lenasia. You may well be voting for someone from Lenasia who's going to appear on a party list. As far as I'm aware, there's no independent candidates who are standing from Lenasia. So just know that you are voting for political parties, and you have the option to vote for an individual. So for the first time, each voter is going to be faced with 3 ballots. And why do you have 3 ballots? Because the National Parliament, which is made up of 400 members, is now split into 2. There are 200 members which are elected purely off a political party list. So it's like the old system. You'll only see political party names, logos, and pictures, or party leader pictures. So you will only choose a political party. There's a second portion of 200 of the 400, which are distributed across the 9 provinces on the basis of the population size of that province. So Gauteng, for example, and KwaZulu-Natal, because of the population size, have allocated out of those 200 seats roughly about 80 or so. And again, that's a hypothetical number. There's a government gazette which says what the designated number per province is, right? So effectively, the province is called a region, and you could use the word constituency if you like, but it's basically called a region. And in the region, that number of votes, that number of seats are available, and you can choose now either a political party or an independent candidate. So it will be a person from Gauteng, either an independent candidate or a person who's high enough on the party list who will go and represent this province in the National Assembly, in Parliament. So that's the second ballot that you'll be voting on. And the third ballot that you're voting on is ordinarily for a person to sit in the Gauteng Provincial Legislature in central Johannesburg to represent the province. So that's the 3 provinces. That's the 3 ballots. Some people argue that this is a step towards a constituency system because, as my explanation would suggest, you are voting for candidates to come from your province, which is doubling up as a constituency. Now, it seems as if it would appear that you're choosing an individual. You're not. The anomaly in the system, which really needs to change because it's very unfair, is that independents are actually competing against political parties, effectively. So if an independent, for example, gets over and above the number of votes that they require to hold 1 seat, and can one individual hold more than 1 seat? No. So all of the votes that they got in excess of the votes required to hold 1 seat are wasted, which means that there is a problem in proportionality and all kinds of things. So it's not an ideal system, but it's a system which accommodates what the Constitutional Court found. And it's a deficient system, by the way. What you can do is ensure that you keep up the pressure for broader electoral reform, which the current Act says the minister has to establish a panel to look at broader electoral reform. So that's your one task after the election. Ensure that there is this panel and that it does come up with a proper electoral system. Thanks very much. Sorry, Angelo.
No, that's fine. Would you like to add, Angelo, or Nomboniso?
So all I think that can be added to that is that it means that when we go into that booth on the 29th of May, We need to be very careful in reading the ballot and very careful in filling out that ballot. 1, 2, and 3. 2 of them will determine what happens in the National Assembly, and 1 of them will determine what happens in your provincial legislature. And it is important to look at those columns very carefully so that you don't mistakenly make a mark, because the ballot will look very different from what it looked like before. So it will now require of all of us to be a lot more reflexive and thoughtful as we stand in that booth. So we may also have to be much more patient as we wait in line, because if there are 70 options for people to go through to find their particular choice, it may take them longer than it used to. So I think we need to invoke for ourselves the patience we had in 1994 and assume it might take longer. And as Maulana Rabat pointed out, not lose courage in that process on a cold May day and leave the queue after an hour, because we used to wait half an hour and now it's 45 minutes. So I think there will be a test not just of the electoral system, but a test of our patience. And the second thing that I think I want to add is to trust the Independent Electoral Commission, which has proven itself in election after election to be above board, to not listen to voices wishing to undo the hard work of establishing credibility by making remarks that have no substance, and to, yes, keep our eyes, as they used to say on police file in apartheid South Africa, keep our eyes peeled, but at the same time accept, 1, there are always international observers, 2, that those international observers are not new, regardless of which country they come from, 3, that this is a natural process in almost all elections around the world, that people are interested in how the election runs, and to be prepared to go through the process in good faith, despite its shortcomings, and then proceed with our critiques and agitation for greater electoral reform after the election. But I think this is going to be a test of our patience and of our willingness to begin to, again, trust the institutions, not the noisemakers on the side who wish to delegitimize the institutions for gains that aren't always immediately available to us.
Nomboniso, would you like to add?
No, just to emphasize where Angela in particular ended. Good evening.
Good evening.
One of the points that you raised is our civic responsibility and our responsibility in ensuring that the quality of our democracy is thriving, not only through elections, as Anita has said, but also before and after. I think that the point that you ended with, Angela, on trusting the Electoral Commission, is very important right now, even before we get into the elections. Obviously, like all other elections, here in South Africa and everywhere, there's a lot of punditry around elections. There are a lot of projections about which party is going to receive how many votes and all of that. And I think it's important to keep a cool head now and acknowledge the fact that nothing is confirmed until actually people have voted and those votes have been counted. So that if people that were told we're going to get 45%, get 25%, we know that it is not about the miscounting or anything untoward, but rather that the projections were not necessarily accurate. But also to trust our own role as South Africans. This time is also a time when a lot of divisions can appear, when we are told not to trust this, not to trust that, but also to trust the community that is around us and ensure that the most accurate information about elections is passed, and that even when we don't have events like this, but with our neighbors and with our communities, we can do that. And also maybe to encourage each other that we do show up. And if you know that your neighbor can't walk that day, to see whether you can help them to get to the polling station.
Absolutely. Thank you for those very important and enlightening points in terms of that very first area that we spoke about, and that is the electoral process. I think it's important, especially going into this election, that we get absolute clarity. The second aspect that we're looking at is governance and accountability. So remember, our analysts are assessing the major political parties in terms of these areas that we're touching on. So some of the aspects that we would perhaps ask them to look at is, what are the records of these parties when it comes to governing inclusively, transparently, effectively? What are the policies in relation to our constitution? What are their records and policies when it comes to corruption and maladministration? Do they act swiftly when it comes to holding their own accountable? Or do they protect their own and drag their feet in processes, or then object to the system when their own are accused? Do their policies address how they would do this differently if there are new parties? We see now, as Kanita has mentioned, there are many new parties that will appear on the ballot. There are perceptions out there that some parties govern better. We know that it's almost taken as a given these days in the political discourse that the DA is better at governance. Is that factually correct? So those are some of the aspects that we're hoping our guests will touch on. Ibrahim, I don't know if you want to go first this time.
I thought it would last in
First out.
Wow. It's a really tough one, because the reality is that none of the parties have actually covered themselves in anything close to glory, or even decency, if you call it that. And it's not far from the truth to say that we have a major crisis of representation. There are very few people who would feel that they actually adequately represented by any one of the political parties. And so the electorate is faced with this really big dilemma. And this big dilemma is that you have a political party like the current governing party, which appears to govern in a way in which they want power without any responsibility, and they want authority without any accountability. That's how I would sum up the ANC's performance in government. The only gift that the ANC has is the gift of a terribly weak opposition. And from an event I just came from now, someone said, perhaps the DA would campaign better if they just sat quietly in a corner and shut up.
Who said that the DA self-compass, unprovoked?
Yes, sitting in a corner, unprovoked, mutilating itself. That was Professor Somadoda Fikeni. But there's an element of truth to it, because the DA is entirely inconsistent in its approach to government. It is inconsistent to its approach to its own rules internally. The ANC is pretty much the same. So you're faced with much of a muchness between those two political parties. And the gift of the ANC, as I say, is a weak, fragmenting opposition which is pooling sort of votes from everywhere else and not hurting the ANC in any way. The third aspect is you have a party like the DA which says we actually want to lead the country, but we don't trust it. We want to lead a set of people that we don't actually trust and we don't like. So we patronize them, we speak to them in a paternalistic way, we treat them as if they're children and they don't know better. The only tragedy for all of us as voters is that the ANC on the campaign trail is extremely humble, and they have a lot of humility. It's the ANC, you know, of a humble organization which has humility, which accepts all their mistakes and so on. The problem is, as soon as they are close to power, all of that humility disappears completely. The DA, by converse, is extremely arrogant when it is campaigning. But notice that when it is in power, it is not as arrogant as it is when it's campaigning. In power, they behave a little more. They're a little more muted. They're a little more responsible. That's not to say they govern well. Make no mistake. I'm simply saying that they're less arrogant once they are in power. And so that's the dilemma that the South African voter faces. Both parties are not in favor of regulated compliance governance. Both parties don't feel that they are accountable. Both parties behave with a great degree of impunity. I mean, how else can the ANC stand up today and claim that they don't own Mr. Jacob Zuma, or that the MK party is not a creation of the ANC itself? 10 years and 8 motions of no confidence, and they protected this person, allowed him to break institutions, allowed him to break the constitution, allowed him to hollow out every city that was a driver of growth and redistribution. And yet today want to repudiate this very person. I mean, the DA, if you take that, I don't know what else there is to say other than the inconsistent approach to government, inappropriate policy, contradictory policy, inability to exercise and apply its own rules internally and in institutions where they govern. Where they govern, they behave with a similar degree of impunity and so on. And if you take the third largest party, and that's not saying much considering that they represent less than 12% of the actual electorate, one is never quite sure what they believe in from day to day. In fact, they may champion one thing today and the complete opposite tomorrow. So this is the dilemma that faces a South African voter. And I know many people, and I don't want to take away from what my colleagues will talk about at the end, many South Africans believe, okay, let's just vote on the basis of our values. And somehow, if you take a long, hard look at all of the major parties, you will find that some of your values are represented in each, and some of your values are contradicted by each of them. So the real dilemma facing you now as a voter is, do you remain being a values voter? So do I vote on the basis of who I see as a party that represents my values, as in my morals, my ethics, my identity, and some of my policy positions? Or do I become a strategic voter? And the strategic voter is someone who decides, I need to punish one of the parties, and I need to punish this party even though I identify with them. I need to punish them by voting for someone else. Or can I vote and reward this party because they did something good? Now, I'm not saying that there is a complete contradiction between a values voter and a strategic voter, but a strategic voter is much more calculating in what the outcome is going to be. And a values voter is much more straightforward in terms of, oh, they represent my values, so I'll vote for them. I wish I would be in a position to tell you who to vote for, but I'm just as confused as you are.
Kanita, I think you've just returned from Cape Town, right?
I did. And
so do they govern better? Sometimes people say when they land in Cape Town, they think in a different country.
It depends which side of the mountain you are on. That's the truth. I mean, there has been fact checks that have been done today by Africa Check that took the DA's claims around them voting better and scrutinized it against data and found that a lot of the claims are misleading. While, claims that 7 out of 8 jobs are created in the Western Cape, for example, and this narrative that if you live in the Western Cape, you're better off in many ways. If you live in some areas of the Western Cape, you are better off. But I want to talk about this decision-making matrix that each voter has to come up with. And I think that the way I look at it is to create a funnel, and so almost like an inverted pyramid of your personal deal breakers. So your non-negotiables from the most important to the least important. And I would limit it to under 10. Because once you go beyond that, I think you're not going to find a single party to vote for. So what are the issues? What are your non-negotiables in terms of who you want to represent? I would even take 5. Whether it's, if you have kids, education is an important aspect. Whether it's issues around land, issues around safety, issues around the economy. and then compare the parties in relation to your deal breakers. And I'll give you an example. If there's a political party that says we must do away with the minimum wage, I don't need to even consider any other of their policies because that's a deal breaker for me. Right? But to another person, a political party that supports race-based quotas is disappointing for them. So that's a deal breaker. So by creating your own personal funnel of these are the 5 most important things to me as a South African, and then to fit political parties into that category is a much better approach, I think. And then to stagger it in terms of what's your most important to least important. For one voter, foreign policy would be the top. For another voter, crime and the fact that there's gangsterism in their community supersedes anything else. So the big political parties have in the past benefited from this arrogance that they portrayed. And Ibrahim's right in that the ANC, when you go on an election campaign with the ANC, and for my sins I've done it for many, many years, you almost feel a sense of genuineness and authenticity that you cannot believe it's the same ANC that you witness after an election period. It's a schizophrenic personality that exists. But what the president does particularly, but also senior members of the ANC, they repeat the problems that they hear from the community back to the community, and they never promise how they're going to actually solve it. So if you listen closely, we know that this area has a shortage of houses. People applaud because they feel like they listen to. But the commitment of, and we will do X, doesn't come, right? And so the second element is with the Democratic Alliance in this election, Ibrahim, which I think is very different from last elections. So there's multiple things that are different in this election for each political party. For the ANC, it is the ANC has been voted out in councils, and we see how they operate in coalition. Number 2, for the DA, we have seen a shift in the DA policies, which I think is probably very empowering for voters to know exactly who you're voting for. You know that this party doesn't support a minimum wage. You know this party doesn't support any transformative policies and agenda, etc., etc., etc. So I think there's something empowering for the voter, not for the party, to know exactly who the DA was, because I think for a long time the DA stood under a cloud of we are not the ANC and benefited from that. When it comes to the EFF and the DA, but have had a period where they've been in power, so they couldn't just wag hands at the ANC, because the DA governs municipalities in Tshwane and other places, and the EFF, what they hate to admit, is in government in Ekurhuleni and in eThekwini and some parts of the West Rand. They're in government. And what is the behavior when they are in council? Like we saw in Ekurhuleni not so long ago. They want to beat up their own coalition partner. So that violent participation in politics, no matter what their leaders say, that violent nature, that streak, is persistent from what happens in Parliament all the way down. And the other very interesting, fascinating, mind-blowing thing about the EFF is that they are really, and I'm saying this objectively based on facts, is that they are a poor opposition when it comes to legislatures, when it comes to councils, and when it comes to Parliament. Their members don't show up, really. So the basic work of being a member of a public representative, unless it's attached to power, they aren't interested in it. And so, or money. Yes, of course. So what I want to say is that in previous elections, it was easy to dispel the 1% party or the 0.5% party. But this election, because of the propensity of coalition governments, or the fact that we are leading towards, at least in one or two provinces, certainly in one or two provinces, and possibly nationally, it matters more than ever to these smaller political parties, because we learned from local government that they can make or break a system.
Nomboniso?
Ibrahim says that we maybe should be more strategic and not necessarily look at values. I want to disagree with that. One of the interesting things, and probably regrettable too, about where political parties are in this election is that a lot of them are converging towards the right and conservative. There's a real disdain that is emerging for poor people, even though all the parties claim to stand for poor people. Where political parties are emboldened to say they do not agree with minimum wage. I mean, if we look at what minimum wage is and we look at cost of living, I don't think that anyone in those leadership of those political parties would consider themselves living below minimum wage. There is also a way in which a really divisive agenda has emerged, for example, against immigrants. And there are a whole range of things that go with xenophobia. It is not Eastern European immigrants that are having a hard time. It is Somalis. It is the othering of people from this continent who have a different religion than what is considered mainstream religion in South Africa, which is Christianity. So there are a whole range of things that increasingly we find that are showing us a troubling picture that might emerge. Yeah. So these things we have to take into consideration. And Ibrahim is correct that, in my view, that we can't only vote on those issues. We've got to look at the funnel that Kanita is talking about. I think without maybe avoiding this, if you were to look at the criteria that you've set, the questions that you've set on governance, you definitely wouldn't vote for the ANC. But then you wouldn't vote for the DA either. And actually you wouldn't vote for the EFF as well. So what are you left with? But if you look at policies, maybe you would want to consider the ANC because it still has some bare minimum policies that are important, particularly for poor people in this country. But if you look at its implementation of those policies, then you still wouldn't vote for them. So there is a kind of trade-off that we have to make. In the communities that I come from in rural Eastern Cape, people ask very clear questions. So when I say to people in my village, the social grants are not a property of the ANC. If the ANC is out of power, you are not going to be without your social grant. They say, yeah, it's great for you to say so, but how can we trust that an opposition party is going to say is going to implement them when their positions are not clear on these things? So I think we have to look at a way in which we balance the kind of South Africa that we want, the kind of South Africa that we are committed to, the kind of responsibilities that you talked about in your introduction, and some of the issues that concern us. My biggest concern with this election is something that has been happening for the last 15 years in particular, where it has become easy, and the ANC has to take responsibility for this, where it has become easy to rubbish the Constitution, where it has become easy to, because the ANC says, the Constitution says this, that, and the other, we can't address land as much as we want because the Constitution has tied our hands. And actually that is not true. So all of the kind of misrepresentations about what the Constitution says and an emerging anti-constitutional democracy agenda. So we've got to ask ourselves what matters most to us. There's a way in which the middle class and the upper middle class, particularly coming from parties like the DA, there's a way in which people who consider the barest minimum, such as voting for social grants, when I have nothing else tangible, I will vote and make sure that I vote for social. Those questions are as critical for them as questions around foreign policy, as concerns around corruption and all of that. So I think that ultimately it is about what you choose, what matters most to you behind that ballot. But I also think that it is about perhaps how we communicate with political parties and kind of explain that some of the positions that they take are not going to pass with voters.
Yeah. All right, so I think we've dealt with 2 of the 5 areas, right? We've dealt with the electoral process and also governance and accountability. I just want to remind the viewers and the listeners, you can WhatsApp your questions for the last segment of the program on 072-786-1548. That's 072-786-1548. And some paper will be circulated for those who would want to write down their questions, and obviously those in attendance will have an opportunity to pose it directly if they so choose. We're going to speed it up a little bit. The third area is society and its needs. It's in 2 parts, the first being healthcare and the second being education. We'll start with healthcare. We'll ask our panelists to share their views in terms of how they assess the major political parties and their performance when it comes to healthcare, the historical record, does it align with their policies, are there contradictions, the NHI, the managing and staffing of public health facilities, remuneration of public sector workers in healthcare, and also some of the manifesto promises when it comes to healthcare. Angela, I think we'll commence with you.
So I think what has come across for many South Africans is that healthcare is an individual patient and a system. And we are living in post-pandemic times. Health is a public concern. We are in a century. We've come out of a century of war. We're in a century of war and disease. Pandemics are coming back. The 2020 experience is something to learn from. This idea that if you are in a private healthcare system, your health will be taken care of, and it doesn't matter what happens to the other 45, 50 million people who aren't in that system. We learned in 2020 that that isn't the case. And so it's important when we assess political parties or health policy proposals, whether those proposals are inclusive, are they about, to go back to Nomboniso's point, what do they imagine South Africa to be like in the future? Kanita's point about what country do you want your children to live in? Because if you're supporting the kinds of solutions, if you look at the policy documents, are they building a public healthcare system in their policy promises that will cater for the health of all of us? Not just the poor, because if the poor have, infection rates of a pandemic kind, we learned in 2020, those of us who are rich, unless we isolate ourselves in our living rooms and never go out, we're as vulnerable as everybody else. When it comes to the new kinds of diseases emerging, particularly with the climate catastrophe unfolding, we are not going to have the luxury of hiding in private clinics. That dream is gone. The second thing to think of is those who are making promises now, we need to be quite careful about whether those promises are realizable. It's one thing to say you're going to be paying nurses multiple blah, 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 but I haven't heard a single political party saying we will peg a nurse's salary, a teacher's salary, and an MP's salary at the same level. They're not cutting their own, money to pay these public servants. And we've seen these examples elsewhere in the world where politicians say, let's clap for our health workers, but they don't pay them. Now, in the emergencies we live in, crime and security, the education of our children, healthcare. These are the people we should be paying, and they're the lowest paid people year on year. They get the lowest increases, like 2%, 3%, so far below inflation. And then we're surprised when the systems that these people have to work in don't work. So when we look at political parties, look at their policies, look at their promises, and then look at their records. Because if you've been running provincial health departments, if you've been involved in a health portfolio in a municipal governance situation, and you haven't done anything that can vaguely be considered making it functional, why should I trust your words now? You can only lie to me so many times. We're 30 years in. And I think that balance of looking at what these parties are promising, comparing it to their records, looking at the words they put on paper, and when they come to us in the next 2 weeks, asking them not just, how are you paying for this? But what is this we're going to be paying people more? Okay, so give me the number of what that will be. Because some of those numbers are embarrassing, right? There are promises from one party that they'll pay something like waiters 5,000 rand a month. Where do they imagine these people live? Yeah. If that is the promise, then what is the vision that they have of the future? And the same with nurses' salaries, police people's salaries, and particularly in our hospitals. They will say, we will combat corruption. Well, if you and your members have been involved in corruption, why should I take your word for it? If you are involved in situations, you're named in SIU reports, why should I trust you? Your organization has not taken action on removing you as an accused and sometimes convicted corrupt person from further political interaction. So your organization will say you're against corruption in the healthcare sector, but protect you. And let's not forget, the Life Esedimeni corruption-induced tragedy happened in this province. So we in Gauteng have absolutely no reason to think it's happening somewhere out there in rural Eastern Cape. It's happening in Gauteng. More than 150 people died, mentally challenged people in this province, because the provincial health department chose, and the ANC deployee chose, to save money and put these people in inappropriate care. That person, immediately after that entire process, was campaigning alongside the party head in the last elections. So can we take that party seriously? And so when it comes to healthcare, this isn't about, as an individual, will I have a medical aid? The NHI is a very important thing to have. We know from the social democracies of post-war Europe that national healthcare systems that allowed everybody to access the same kind of health was an important way to build equality. We cannot continue to pretend to want equality and pretend that only government is responsible for making inequality. We have all contributed and continue to contribute to making inequality by our choices. When I go to a private hospital to get some emergency process done, I'm bypassing and using class privilege to get access. My cultural capital as an educated, well-spoken, fairly empowered middle-class person would be far more powerful in the public hospital, because I could make changes by simply being there and participating in this. When I'm in Amsterdam, when I was in Utrecht and I needed to, healthcare, I went to the local clinic and I was treated. I wasn't asked to prove my passport, demonstrate any kind of presence. And so what we need to do is begin to imagine an inclusive healthcare system, because health is a communal component of social life. It isn't just an individual choice. There are individual components to healthcare, yes. But for the most part, during pandemics, and there are more coming, H1N1 in the global north, we know that there are more diseases coming from the United Nations officials tasked with these kinds of things. Do we imagine that sitting in a private clinic is somehow going to protect us from disease and its social component? And so for me, the judgment would be manage through the funnel system to think of what are people's words, what are their promises, are they realizable, are they realistic, and what is their record where they have held portfolios. Because how many times can you slap me in the face and continue to tell me you're about peace? At what point do I say you're clearly not about peace? I can't keep inviting you back to my house.
Yeah. Nomboniso, your thoughts?
The dilemma is that I think most of us agree that we need NHI, that we need to build our public health system in such a way that it caters for everybody. We are clear about that. The problem is when you think about that it's going to be an ANC-led government that is going to implement that. This is where it becomes problematic. It becomes even more problematic when we look around other political parties, when we look at the DA, when we look at the EFF and all this, and we actually, there is no sense of comfort that we get from them in thinking, okay, we can agree on the policy, but maybe we'll vote for different guys to come and run this. Also, where the DA has, in the Western Cape, for example, where they have had some leverage, maybe not on national competency, but where they could have used their own, the provincial administrative powers to extend services to people, they haven't done so. So I think this is where the dilemma is. And perhaps we could also look at the fact that even though we don't know how much the ANC is going to lose, but it is likely that their support is going to drop at the polls. So perhaps we can start looking at other smaller parties that who may have policies on health that may align with what we want to see, and perhaps diversify our vote into the smaller parties.
Kanita?
I'm mostly covered on this topic, but just to say that the tragedy of where South Africa is at the moment is that an amazing ideal, which is universal basic healthcare, is being perverted because the party tasked with implementing it has a track record of repurposing good policies for personal gain. And so there's an example, and it's a very simplistic one, but I implore you to just follow the line of thinking. There's what is this thing called? Licensing department in Waterfall, Midrand.
Yes.
That is absolutely stellar. And it is a far cry if you go 5 kilometers to the next one. Your experience is worlds apart. And it's simply because the people who work at that licensing department want to see it work. There's a lady who, I have never seen more jubilant South Africans hoping and praying there was a request for a bribe after services were rendered because it was done so well and efficiently. And so for me, having experienced that quite recently, I thought there's an incentive for good service. But in healthcare and in other areas of the state, there isn't, because the fish rots from the head down. Yeah. And so if you are a nurse in Tembisa Hospital, what is the incentive for you to give adequate care when the fat cats on the top are plowing through and paying 1,000 rand for one swab that the nurse is using because of corruption and patronage, right? And so that is the tragedy of this moment that we are when it comes to NHI. Granted the fact that we have a head of state that was looking for his pen for the last 4 months. Angelo, I don't know where he's going to find that pen, probably in the Pala Pala mattress. But the point is that South Africa lives in this really crazy scenario where you have really great ideals, and at the same time you see the worst of humanity. And the healthcare system for me is the greatest example of that. My father was at the mercy of public healthcare until he died, and had the great fortune of seeing some of the best doctors in the world because they were employed by the South African state. But he also had to queue for 8 hours every month to access his medication. And that was his norm for 20 years of his life. And that was a privileged scenario. That was not a Gogo in the Eastern Cape that had to, travel kilometers to get to the nearest clinic. He lived in an urban area. And so that dichotomy persists and really is a scary thing for me.
So on the other aspect of society and its needs is education. And I suppose you've got two categories there, basic education and higher education. We know about the concern around the ability to read for meaning, the infrastructure crisis, pit latrines, the school management crisis, ministerial and MEC accountability. When it comes to higher education, TVET, NSFES, crisis again, maladministration of universities, governance crisis, UCT, then the fees crisis, the challenge of graduate unemployment, and then in the case of the ministers in both portfolios, they've been there like forever. And many would say that with very little accountability. And then provincially, there's a lot of disarray. So, Nomboniso, your thoughts when it comes to how the political parties, the major ones at least, are faring in terms of their track record, their policies, their ideas, when it comes to both basic and higher education?
You know, all of us have moments that we remember that we could pinpoint that South Africa was changing. You know, something that you experienced for the first time. For me, it was in 1995 in my village when I had gone home after having been away for 6 months. And there was a homestead that had been, had been abandoned. Well, these people had moved to Cape Town. And this homestead now, the village had agreed, with having negotiated with these people, that it was going to be a preschool. Where I come from, the notion of a creche didn't exist when I grew up. The idea that there was a place where women could go and drop their kids and then they would do other things, and these children would get preschool education simply didn't. And for me, this was one of those key moments that I remember when I knew that you could go and work in the plow fields, your kids were being looked after somewhere else. Your kids were getting an early start like other children in introduction to the alphabet and all of that. And if I remember, when I look back, between 1995 and 1999, a lot of things happened. We got electricity, we got piped water. We even started having the extended public works programs where women could work and earn a living and all of that. All of those programs that were tangible in terms of, if I could say, how quality of life was changing, all of them have collapsed today. All of them. They have collapsed because of corruption. The only program that still exists is the Extended Public Works Program, which now local councillors use for patronage system. So if I were to look at it from this perspective, I would say that the ANC, therefore, after that, lost its claim to my vote. But the DA has been in Parliament just as long. There hasn't been a situation where the opposition parties in Parliament, Inkatha Freedom Party and all these parties, where they have used their presence in Parliament and actually brought this to their attention in a way that goes beyond parliamentary speeches. So if I look at education, I find it very, very difficult to find all the political parties that have been in Parliament since 1994. So that would have to be a consideration that I would have to make, because the failures are not only the failures by a ruling party. There are also failures by political parties that are in opposition in making these things, these issues, to be issues that they matter. We know that when Jacob Zuma had to leave, when we wanted Jacob Zuma to leave, we know that political parties in Parliament were pushing all those votes of no confidence, that the ANC undermined. So the fact that opposition parties have not made these issues critical issues and put them on the center of the political agenda, it means that even to them, these issues are not necessarily important. And again, this is where the tragedy is.
Angela?
So education is fairly one of my deal-breaker issues, to use Kanita's phrase. To live in this country and have 81% of 10-year-olds unable to read for meaning is a moral outrage. And I don't think anybody looking back at South Africa between 2010 and 2030 is going to think it happened by accident. It's going to look like, and I can tell you it already looks like it is done by design.
Yeah.
To invoke Edward Said, the Palestinian-American professor, who said, the trouble if you don't have a critically literate population is that you then have people in their billions who are exploitable by people who want to use them for profit or people who want to exploit them to maintain power. And isn't it ironic that that is exactly where we are? So all of the problems that we have been describing in our political class is exploitable because we have an exploitable population. If one goes back in the ANC's history, and this is partly why the ANC can be so horrifically indicted by me, you read the letters of, Z.K. Matthews, you read the books of Z.K. Matthews, the letters of A.B. Kluma, a former president of the ANC, and education as a matter of quality delivery to create the kinds of citizens that could build a South Africa that was not a colonial or an apartheid state was at the forefront of what they were fighting for. I don't think anybody who is currently in the ANC's leadership will have their letters or their books read, and that includes people who've recently released books 10 years from now, 20 years from now, except as embarrassing documents. The Democratic Alliance's own position on education in the Western Cape is to maintain a two-tier system. There are people in the Western Cape who have an education, and again, this is about quantification. We have a National Minister of Education who reads out numbers, pass rates, numbers of people. We have a party that says so many more people are finishing school and just forgets about the half of those kids who start school who never finish. They simply don't figure in the ledger. We have a provincial government who talks about the number of schools they've built. We should be talking about curricula. We are sitting in a century with unfolding crises, and in none of the major parties am I seeing curriculum reform that deals with the unfolding crisis that we are going to be sitting with. Increasing famine, greater insecurity, food insecurity, etc. People are talking fourth industrial revolution. We're going to have tablets in every school. We're going to have teachers trained in technology. That's all very nice to have, but if we don't have the basics, what's the point of having an illiterate person with a tablet? All they are is a target for a potential thief. But that will come to in our next section. Our universities have been whole-scale transformed into businesses. The gap between what executive managers earn and what actual junior lecturers, professors earn, tells you where the emphasis is. Think of the embarrassing behavior that Jonathan Jansen, of all people, has had to call out by our university class. They're behaving exactly like apartheid universities used to behave. All we have to do is teach, create a nice group of people who are professionals who can run the society as it is at the moment. They're not divesting from horrific spaces that they should be in. We have vice-chancellors who appear proudly next to robotic dogs that were bought from weapons manufacturers in the United States. They didn't even design or make the robot themselves. They bought it. And they celebrated this as some kind of achievement of technological advance. That's like me going into Clicks or into any supermarket, buying their products, going outside and saying, look at me, am I not proud to have used this? I did not invent this, I did not make this. The CSIR found that many of our master's and doctoral degrees, this was published 2 years ago, do not meet the requirements we set up through SAQA in post-apartheid South Africa. Because what we've become is a society that values the titles, the certificates, applaud the numbers of people who walk across stages or get distinctions, and don't ask, do these people build a future South Africa? And again, this is where we make our stand. We all live here. I'm not migrating. I might be forced to migrate, but that's the only time I'll leave. This is where I'll be buried. My kifayat/janaza will probably be here. My question is, what is the society we want to live in our old age and that we want our children to live in? We'd like them not just as individuals, but to live in a society where more people are educated. Because it's pointless being the only person in a room who can read and you value reading and nobody else can. It's pointless being the great mathematician who can do trigonometry, but everybody else is having difficulty adding 1 and 1. These are communal political issues. There are no individual solutions. Our behavior must therefore be communal. Look at these policies that are proposed. Look at the behavior. And in terms of education, I would say, as urgently as health, the future that is being built by these parties is a future where they maintain power, but they seem to have very little interest. And my last remark on this is, we have had warnings about this. In late apartheid South Africa, one of the greatest intellectuals produced by the apartheid opposition was Njabulo Ndebele. And he warned against sloganeering in politics. He said we must beware of politicians taking slogans and never adding substance to them. To say we want decolonial education is a very nice slogan. What does that mean? What does it mean to have transformed curricula? What is the transformation supposed to lead to? We must also be aware of misinformation, where we listen to people who say things about education policies and simply take them at their word. All of this stuff is made public. One of the things that we have in this country that we must be, valuing is the publicity of information. The government would like to do things in secret. They often do things in secret, but these policies are published. So it is our duty to not just go and vote on the 29th, but to participate in the processes that come before and after it, to comment on policies, to object to policies, and to object to them through the systems rather than just go on television and make unpleasant remarks and so forth. In conclusion on this issue, I think in education, I have yet to see a single party that articulates for me the kind of vision that I would want to see for the future, not just for myself, my own children, or but for all children in this country. And when politicians come to me, this will be the deal breaker that I confront them on.
Kanita?
I think that, very briefly, that education is missed by all political parties. And I think it's a great place as society to step into political to step into your political power by reclaiming that part. And I think I say this quite often, and I'll repeat it now, is that the mistake we have done is outsource politics to politicians. And I think when it comes to our children, and when it comes to education, I think that reclaiming that power in whether it is in and that's what South Africa at this critical moment is going to have to look like. That we're going to have to create reading groups so that we don't perpetuate a generation of poverty because kids can't read with meaning. If we want to really care about the future of South Africa, we will build libraries. We will stand outside the Johannesburg Library and insist that it's opened by the inefficient city of Johannesburg. And so I think that education for me is one that I don't look for a solution in politics, because I find that the populism that exists there is actually it's actually awful to what we have to then subject our kids to. And so if anything, if there's a place that you are looking for a practical expression of politics, I think it's in education. And I think there's different tiers of it, where it's, Angelo said, of mobilizing in terms of policy through the system. There's a Bella Bill that's Bella Act soon that needs engagement on. There's the state of NASFAs, for example. But I think beyond that, I think is reclaiming it so that the power then resides with the people, so that we understand what schools are I don't know the actual terminology in terms of how the GDE terms it, but which are the poor schools, which are the high-performing schools, which schools have kids who come there and do not have food to eat, and that pass rates are linked to poverty levels. And so I think that if I implore anything tonight is, if there's one place that we can play a role, I'm sure certainly having thoughts about it, how can I play a more meaningful role when it comes to educating our future generations?
Shukran. So I'm just going to rush the panelists a little bit as we move into the fourth of the 5 areas that we're going to cover before we take questions from the floor. And that is safety and security. It's obviously a very important discussion, from crime to policing to prosecution or the lack thereof, sexual violence, femicide, gangsterism, remuneration of police, parallel structures of policing which may not always be in line with the constitution, rural areas being neglected, inner cities being neglected, policies at national and provincial level not always being in line with research, and then the return to kind of colonial and apartheid practices in terms of imagined solutions. So, Ibrahim, I think we'll start with you.
You guys noticed they didn't ask me any of the questions on health or education because I'm not an academic or I didn't study medicine. And now they asked me the questions about crime. I don't know if that's a subtext or what, but I mean, the truth is that no society can be policed into safety. No society can be policed into safety. You can't. The approach of a heavy-handed approach to policing, and that if you have better police, you'll have a better society, simply doesn't work. We have to ask hard questions about the nature of our society, both at the bottom and at the top. So we live in a society in which the private ethics have been completely eroded and public morality is completely absent. And when your private ethics are completely eroded, no amount of policing can help. If you beat your wife up, or you are a violent person, or interpersonal violence amongst people themselves. And most of South Africa's murders and physical crime is committed amongst not just intimate partners, but amongst people who know each other. Of course, there's a long history of people in public authority ignoring the question of crime, stretching back all the way to President Mbeki. For two reasons. A, because you couldn't get the policing system right, and secondly, did not want to face up to the reality of the crisis that animated the base of society. But the private sector is no better. The private sector is no better. Collusion, price fixing, excessive executive pay, I mean, it's criminal for someone, and you can hold my feet to the fire on this question. If anyone earns 83 million rand per year, excluding long-term and short-term benefits, I think we can agree that's a little criminal. So you've got this erosion of public morality along with private ethics. And so we have to look at reforming and rehabilitating, firstly, the base of society. And secondly, we have to move away from the privatization of security, which is what we've done. We have a greater number of people who are armed but are not within the control of the state. They are not within the control of public authority. They are in private security companies. And any society in which the preponderance of private security prevails over public order is a recipe for disaster, because that gives rise to militias, it gives rise to private armies, it gives rise to, in inverted commas, no-go areas, and it gives rise to vigilantism. And if we need to stem the tide of that, then we have to restore trust in the police. Now, the one thing all the political parties have failed at is, and this is a hallmark of any sort of criminal justice system, there has to be predictability, fairness, and consistency in the application of the rules. And we have a complete absence of that. There is no predictability, there's no consistency, and there's no fairness. If you and I commit the same crime, but because I know more politicians than you do, I'm likely to get off with a lot more than you are able to do. So it's not predictable. The sentence would not be fair, and it is not consistent in the way in which it's approached. So there's a problem with safety and policing at the whole base of society, and I hate to tell you that none of the parties have given sufficient attention to the question of safety, security, and policing. They either veer on denialism, or the heavy-handed approach to crime, or it's just a problem which is going to resolve itself over time. Now, I don't think we can rely on politicians for this, and this is the bad news. It is an election issue because of what parties say, but don't have any hope in parties being able to fix this. The problem is that the rot is far too deep, not just in the police service, but also in the society. If you have high levels of gangsterism and we have murder rates which outstrip murder rates of places in active conflict, armed conflict, war, then there's a problem in the base of society. So we have to rehabilitate our own behavior, and we can't rely on the public authority to ensure that they do it. What we can expect from them is consistency, predictability, and fairness in the application of the system. But beyond that, we have to start thinking of how we relate to each other, how we relate to people, and how we relate to the police themselves. If we give a greater amount of trust and credibility, maybe over time things might shift incrementally. But at the base of it, we have to look at our own behavior.
Kanita?
Yeah, just to add that when I was I was chairing a panel with political party leaders, and that same question came up, and political party leaders veered to the extreme. We must, send 20,000 police officers, or the question of whether socioeconomic status plays a role in the level of crime, and that was the assertion made. And John Steenhuisen of the DA said, well, if socioeconomic situations, when you were talking within the context of the Western Cape, resulted in violent crime, then India should have been a violent society. But what they don't realize is inequality is the vulgarity that leads to the violent nature of the society that we live in. We live in an untenable, unequal society. And that will just perpetuate the level of extreme violence that we have. That we have bastions of privilege surrounded by squalor, and it's normalized in society. Everywhere you go in this country is something that cannot and would not solve the problems. And so what we have to learn as South Africans is that we will never be safe in gated communities with tall gates when poverty lies just on the other side of it. It is a system not made to work, and more importantly, I think, will never lead to any lasting solutions.
Angelo?
So mine is a short answer. We were warned again in 1988 by John Coetzee, who, in analysing South Africa, said, apartheid's ruling class want fraternity without equality and without liberty. I would say that post-apartheid South Africa's ruling class wants liberty and fraternity without equality. And you cannot have those. They are inextricably linked. And until we commit to that, the promises that our politicians make by suggesting they will solve crime and that should get our vote is a 20th century solution to a problem that has been addressed by 20th century research, which they seem ignorant of. To reiterate Ibrahim and Kanita's points, flinging more guns and more power and more kragtadige aksie didn't resolve the violence of colonial or apartheid South Africa. In fact, it exacerbated it. And we're seeing the same thing over the last 30 years. Shoot to kill is not a policy that works if you don't fix the problems that lead to people behaving in the ways that they do. And one of those problems is building inequality actively in post-apartheid South Africa, not just saying, we accidentally got here. We didn't accidentally get here. Government didn't just bring us here. We all participate in making this country every day. And so our behavior on the 29th of May on the issue of crime cannot be to suggest and believe politicians who say they will fling more money at police and security, more equipment, and somehow this will resolve and give us safety. None of the research backs that up.
All right. The last aspect that we touch on is...
So the last thing that we haven't... I agree with everything that the panelists have said. The situation of domestic violence and femicide, gender-based violence and femicide, requires all of us to look at the kind of solutions that have been proposed and go back to the drawing board. Looking at the political parties and manifestos on this, well, I haven't read all of them, but the one party that has, in fact, highlighted the need to look at the root cause is the rise in Zanzibar. And even them, I think it's point number 6 or number 7 down the line there. So if we look at how inequality, and here in this country we have violent inequality, and how that fits. If you drive from OR Tambo towards Johannesburg, you will see a huge billboard that advertises armored cars. This is the way in which, in this society, we have normalized providing private solutions for ourselves. But the extent of gender-based violence and femicide requires, I think, that we have more and more conversations about how do we deal with this scourge in our society.
Absolutely. On the issue of South Africa, both in the region and internationally, there's the aspect of xenophobia, ethno-nationalism, the alignment in terms of BRICS and the international dynamics, energy crisis, climate change, and then I suppose what is more in focus, positions on the world on the precipice of conflict, whether it be in Africa, the DRC, Sudan, Somalia, or whether it be the genocide in Palestine, the Syrian crisis, Ukraine, and the likes. And I think it comes back to that old discussion about values-based voting versus strategy-based voting. And I suppose a very direct question would be, how much of consideration do you give to foreign policy when deciding what is the deal breaker or not, in terms of that funnel that Kanita spoke about earlier on? Angelo, can we start with you on this one?
We live on one little blue marble, and it's spinning out in this particular uninteresting corner of space. It's all of us together or none of us at all. Any political party that suggests that they can have exclusions, whether they're foreigners, whether they're people elsewhere in the world, whether it is about isolationist politics, the crises that we face as a species, and we face on this planet. There's nowhere else, despite the delightful dreams of Mr. Musk. Should he land on Mars, he will be there for 70 seconds before he dies. So, you know, that's a choice that he can make. We all live here. And so my sense is that foreign policy is an important component of how we hold our governors to account on how we engage with the rest of the world. I'm not certain, and I say this as somebody with a very strong set of principles on the DRC and our behavior there, Somalia, Palestine, but it cannot be for me the deal breaker in a national election as the only thing that's going to determine how I vote. It is one of the things that determines how I vote, and there are parties whose position on the genocide in Gaza is not what I can at any level support, and so they will not get my vote. And if that is for you the deal breaker, by all means, but it has to be one of a bouquet of issues. It cannot be the one thing that is, for me, the deal breaker.
Kanita, you know how emotive the Palestinian issue is in the Muslim community. How do you assess the political parties in terms of foreign policy?
Yeah, I think that so when it comes to our buffet of political parties, you have those who are very clear on their stance. You have those who are a little bit more ambiguous about, especially when it comes to the situation in Gaza. But there's this narrative that persists that South Africa is burning. We can't worry about our neighbors because, you know, we have to put the fire off here. And I think that makes me deeply uncomfortable, that sentiment. But just to say, I spoke to, I was engaging a community in the Western Cape, moderating a discussion there last week, and that seemed to be the only issue. And that funnel was basically that particular issue. And I think that sometimes political parties manipulate voters in that way, and so we must just be aware of that. But I'd spoken just informally to a representative from the EFF and said, you know, why do you think it's such a viscerally important issue to certain communities? And they said, if it's a humanity thing, right? So your baseline for voting for someone is that they should just have basic humanity. And when I thought about it and it settled, and you take away the politics from it, there has to be this barometer of So it isn't the complications of whether we agree on a two-state solution or one-state solution in Palestine, or whether we should we supporting the RSF in Sudan or not. That nitty-gritty is secondary issues. At the core of it is how comfortable I am with the humanity of ex-political party, and I think that's the lens that voters should look at through.
Nomboniso, the issue of foreign nationals has become quite a talking point, and there's quite a bit of debate between political parties. We've seen political parties shift their positions also, depending on what the political climate has been. So at times you hear about, that these are all colonial boundaries, we are one continent, we are all Africans. On the other hand, at times you hear about the scarcity of jobs and the competition, for resources in our country. What's your assessment of how the major political parties, at least, are positioning themselves when it comes to this particular aspect?
Well, to be frank, I think that both the ANC and the DA know that the issue is not about illegal immigrants. It's not what they make it out to be. I'm saying this because in 1995 already, there was a team that was set up by President Mandela, which included Chief Buthelezi, Mamphela Ramphela, and others, to actually investigate the extent to which illegal migration was a problem in South Africa. And they went as far as going up to the border and looking at what was happening. And so the problems are known. The problems of illegal immigration, even if we subscribe to the open borders and all that, you need to have some kind of management of movement. So the collapse of that is an ANC creation. It's because of incompetence, it's because of all these things. But I think that also there is something that is deeply, deeply uncomfortable in saying that people from Zimbabwe, people from Lesotho, should not come into South Africa, whether they are documented or undocumented, in times of distress, because they built the economy of this country. We built the economy of this country together. So I think that making this issue an issue of illegal migration issues and all that is actually just, blaming people for the poor management by the ANC. The issue around opening of borders, and personally, I would like to see free movement in this continent. But in reality, what I would like is just a respect of what the Constitution says to begin with. The fact that hospitals are overcrowded in Johannesburg is not because of illegal immigrants. They are overcrowded because the ANC has dropped the ball, because they pay high salaries to top people because of corruption and all these issues. And it's basically reinventing the same kind of narrow ethno-nationalism that we see everywhere else. If you look at the United States, for example, surely you can see that the kind of solutions that are being provided, they don't work. And we know that the debate around illegal immigration is not about illegal immigration. It is about foreigners. It is about discomfort with people that have come to live amongst us. Where I come from, in the communities in the Eastern Cape, where Somalis live, where Zimbabweans live, they are not the problem. Actually, they run spaza shops because the previous shop owners are no longer able to do so. They provide credit to those communities, and they are becoming increasingly integrated. And going back to the issue of values, do we want a South Africa that isolates itself from its neighbors? Or do we want a South Africa that is envisaged in the Constitution? Do we want all the time to kill our neighbors because we are unemployed? If you were to say all the illegal or even all the foreigners should leave, would there be jobs in South Africa? Are these people really taking jobs? We've talked about health. We've talked about the health system. We've talked about education, higher education. How many graduates are unemployed? And is it because of illegal immigrants? And the answer is no. Yeah. This is a problem that has been created by and this is where for me, the issue around the genocide becomes important. And I would like a situation where we can see the humanity of Palestinians, the humanity that is denied by Israelis, and say that we would like to be known through history as people who stood with them. Yeah. And similarly, I would like to see that happening with my neighbors in the region, to say that I stood with Zimbabweans in the way that they stood with us during apartheid.
Ibrahim, just to close this particular aspect, right? I once interviewed, I think, Helen Ziller about the Palestinian issue, and she spoke, and Kanita kind of alluded to it, about the sphere of influence and the sphere of concern. And she said these international issues fall within the sphere of concern, but we don't have much influence, and we need to focus on our areas of influence. That said, in light of what has happened since October 7th, right, the ANC government has been lauded the world over for the position, the very courageous position that it took at great political and economic risk. And we see the narrative developing here in South Africa that it has been pretty much the ANC and the EFF from the major political parties that have stood in solidarity with the Palestinians. And the others have either been like the Gayton McKenzie and company, quite brazenly in favor of or in support of Israel, others trying to project themselves as being somewhere in the middle, but they're not really there, being somewhat apologetic about the whole thing, or wishy-washy. The issue I want your comment on, Ibrahim, is about how much does the funding and the funders of these political parties play when it comes to especially the positions that they take as far as foreign policy is concerned. You may or you may not have seen, but within our communities there's a kind of WhatsApp message circulating, a poster, and they've got pro-Palestinian and anti-Palestinian parties. And let me round off this question with this. We understand the aspect of Zionism and what Zionism stands for. But there is also this narrative being pushed by the ANC in particular, that there's a big agenda by the Zionists to take over South Africa. And the whole aspect of, call it a separatist state in Cape Town and the like. Is that politicking? Is that just electioneering speak? Or is there a genuine concern that if you look at the funding of those parties that have aligned themselves on the wrong side of this Palestinian issue, should we be concerned as voters, and should that then become that deal breaker? You see where the funding is coming from.
If you're asking me that question, are we all ready to settle in till Fajr, inshallah? Because this is a massive question. But I mean, the reality is he who pays the piper calls the tune. Now, there are some parties who are taking a slightly more independent stance away from their donors, and we should give them credit for that. But I think we must just place two things into perspective. The idea of regime change is both a bogey and a reality. It's a bogey in the sense that, see, the ANC didn't lose the major metros, which are the drivers of growth and redistribution, because of an external agenda. They lost it because of their own poor performance in government. So that idea of a change in regime is not because of an externally imposed agenda. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that there is no danger implicit in the current geostrategic set of alliances to want to impose a regime change agenda on South Africa. There is no present danger of that happening. No one wants to actively intervene. If anyone wants to change the government in South Africa, it is South Africans themselves. So there's no danger of a neo-colonial imperialist push for regime change. That doesn't mean it's not coming. There's a bipartisan bill before the US Congress which wants to review the relationship that South Africa has. The British, as we know, often sort of is the tail that follows the dog. And so if the US decides one thing, Britain might follow, and so might the rest of Europe. Germany has come out, shame, to their credit, they've come out as the neo-Nazis of today. Because they very brazenly are saying they oppose the South African case at the ICJ. They are going to take it on head on. They are banning protests in Germany. The Americans are doing the same. So much for democracy assistance, by the way. Perhaps they need some democracy assistance. But there's no implicit agenda for it happening right now, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't guard against it, right? But this idea that there is a Zionist agenda to take over the country and infiltrate it, I think is a little bit far-fetched, and it is electioneering, and the ANC must be clear that regime change is actually a fundamental part of democracy, as long as the regime is changed by domestic actors, not by external actors. And that was the problem in Zimbabwe, where you had the kind of push of nationals to save national sovereignty and pitted it against popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the sovereign of the people who make up the society. Now, what we have is a push for popular sovereignty, not a push for wanting someone to undermine our national sovereignty. That said, there are external funders and donors who are pumping money into the country. It is a danger. It is something we are vigilant of. But to the credit of the ANC, while it will wildly propound this rhetoric, they themselves are watching very closely, and they are, to their credit, an anti-colonial, anti-imperial party. There may come a time where there will not be, because the money will be lucrative enough, but they aren't there yet.
Thank you to all the analysts for the perspectives that they've shared. We're now going to go to the floor for questioning. I'm going to ask whoever wants to ask questions, so maybe just queue up there to make it easier for the camera people. So if you queue up along the side and then just come in front. We have also here Mr. Yunus Sakur, the CEO of Radio Ansar, and Mr. Faisal Suleiman, the station manager. If you would like to ask any questions, please feel free to do so. Whilst we're just getting the mics and all of that sorted out, I'll go through one or two of the questions that have come in. The one is that once the voting is done, so I'll ask the panelists just to make notes. We'll go through all the questions and then, take your comments and answers. Once the voting is done, what mechanisms are in place for citizens to easily and successfully hold parties and representatives accountable without fear? What mechanisms are in place for transparency when it comes to the actions of public servants? The other question is about the influence of big corporations on this upcoming elections and multinationals, and to what extent do they influence then the positions taken by political parties? The third comment also that I'm just touching on randomly from the various comments that have come in from the viewers and the listeners. What role do you think that social media will play in this election in South Africa, considering the kind of role that it is assumed to have played in the last US election? Then one of the questions that have come in here in writing, considering what our panelists have said, it looks like that they don't have much confidence in any of the major political parties. Could smaller parties such as Al-Jama'ah gain more voters in this election and increase their number of seats? And should that be the direction in which we look some of the smaller political formations?
Maybe they're not for you.
Maybe not. If I need to protect my reputation, I better not answer that question.
Okay, so I see that Al-Jama'ah is here, Raizim Zanzi is here. I saw
Can we answer these as
someone from the Sun Party, Rashid Gata as well. We'll listen to you first. Let's just keep it brief, right? Because it's getting fairly late. I didn't want to stop the panelists because I think they were touching on some very important issues and I wanted them to elaborate, especially for the online audience. But let's keep our comments and questions brief and to the point. Yeah, you can stand there. I think that would be the best angle.
Jazakallah, assalamu alaikum, peace be upon all. Jazakallah khairan to Radio Islam and every esteemed media present tonight to ensure the importance of this particular elections. Also, let me take the opportunity to thank you, Malana. I think in my view, you carefully and very well presented the reality on the ground with us as a tremendous dismal failure in our country, that our country is undergoing in terms of every single service delivery and corruption at its highest levels, including wasteful expenditure. But more importantly, my question is, as a patriotic citizen, many of us, we need positive ways and means of finding solutions that surely needs to offer hope to South Africa. So I'm given to understand our analysts, many of the analyses that have been presented have been very long around. All of the panelists here are very experienced. And I find that besides yourselves, the presentation, projects itself to in fact make it more confused for the voters. And that's the reality. Because the country is in a mess. And in terms of where we're standing presently, it makes it worse. So I want to ask the panel and ourselves, after a wonderful analysis, to provide strategic guidance and a more strong and informed choice of guidance for crafty, wise decisions to help assist our country and voters. Now, we spoke a lot about the failures, and worst of all, at election times, the spin doctoring of many of the political parties, and that's a reality. And also, I would like the panel to clearly, in 2 minutes, each one of you present a clear solution that they feel will be a moral compass or strategic way to seriously answer our problems that we have in South Africa. So we need a serious difference in our country. Though we lost our moral compass, let me end by saying, in adversity, we can achieve, with healthy, good dialogue, like tonight, a solution for the future of South Africa. Always in adversity, there can always be achievements. And we've seen this throughout history, that many of the leaders that have come from previous nations, as well as now, they've excelled and managed to find solutions by way of what? Only the times when there are adversities and challenges can we find solutions in the country. Thank you so much.
Mr. Ibusaku, Program Director. Anybody else who wants to ask questions, just can come to the front.
Program Director, Maulana Sulaiman Rawat, our panelists, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Yunus Sekur, I'm the CEO of Al-Azhar Foundation and the Media Network. Shukran Maulana for inviting us to this gathering this evening. We really appreciate it. Congratulations to the panel on a wonderful presentation. However, I just want to change the subject slightly on elections to look at the registered voters, which is roughly about 42 million, of which the number of potential voters, 42 million, of which 27 million has registered. So there's a large gap of approximately 14 million that haven't registered. So he's giving a message to the political parties that either we have no confidence in you or we're not interested in voting. Now, this broadcast is going mostly to the minority communities, Maulana, if I'm correct, and they obviously need some guidance how to vote. Do they vote for the ruling party as they've done when democracy reached us, or do they swing to the smaller parties, or do they follow what the majority of people are saying in terms of Palestine? We're not going to support certain parties. But having said that, if you look at the profile of South Africa, then you find that the majority of voters are from the African community. And they have a certain mindset on which political party they're going to support from democracy and 30 years hence. Now, if you look at performance, and I think the panelists have covered it, but broadly speaking, many panelists spoke about housing, and I was in that particular field for a number of years. And when we discovered what was the housing need when democracy set in, we needed 20 million housing units to sort out the problem in South Africa, of which only about 5 million has been delivered for 30 years. So the ruling party has failed in that 15 million haven't been delivered. Even if you delivered 1 million a year, you would have sorted out the backlog. But like that, there are many other challenges. The reality we face, and I'd just like to pose one question to the panelists, that will we have business as usual and the pattern will be the same as happened in the last 30 years in terms of his renewal policy? Will people go to the polls, the election day, and put their 3 crosses against a particular name and don't apply their mind strategically as indicated by Ibrahim this evening, because they may not have time to think about it? So I'm just posing that one question. I know there are many other questions, but voters want to know how to vote this evening, and perhaps we can give some guidelines. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
I'm just going to read out whilst we go to the next question, something that talks to the point from one of our viewers. The panelists need to address the phenomenon that is still ruled by a minority. Less than 50% of eligible voters will participate. Should voting not be made compulsory in order to make the process more meaningful? Okay, next question. Introduce yourself.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Rosalind Cassidy. I'm not from this part of the world. I'm from Joburg East. but I'm here with my friend who was invited by, or is part of ASRI. Thank you to the panelists and to the people who've organized the event. I just wanted to make a few comments, and then I have one question. So I've been very fortunate to have lived in 3 countries, the UK, Australia, and South Africa, and to be politically active in all those countries. So I've had the chance to kind of see the way democracies mature and how mature democracies operate. So, for example, when I went to the UK, was in 1983. I went to live there, and I remember how corrupt the police force was, and what London's crime was like at the time, and I kind of hear a lot of the same things being said here now about South Africa, and I suppose what I can say is that things do change and democracies do mature and electorates mature. So, in South Africa we have actually a very politically sophisticated electorate compared to other countries that I've been in, where they, like in Australia, you have to vote, like you are fined if you don't. But basically, more or less people don't vote. They don't know what to vote for. They don't know who they're voting for. So, my question. Okay, thank you. The other thing to say is that corruption is a way of life in South Africa. It's not just an ANC problem, and I put my hand up here. I am an ANC member. I've been an ANC member for the last 40 years, and on some of the ballots I will still be voting ANC. But corruption isn't just an ANC problem. It's endemic in our country now. I was listening to somebody talking about there being 30,000 teaching jobs in Gauteng or in the country, and then I heard somebody else, a young woman, ring in and say that she was a teacher, a qualified teacher, and the only way she could get a job was to buy it for 50,000 rand. So, yeah. So my question is about voting strategically. And Kanita, I really liked your funnel way of deciding who we're going to vote for. But, in terms of voting strategically and not wasting my vote and not splitting an important vote, how can we find out how big the other parties like Rise Mzansi and Bosa and the other parties, how could we find out, like, would my vote count? How do I, yeah, thank you.
I won't answer. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everyone. 2 quick questions. One is, from 2021, there was a flirting of the DA and the ANC coalescing to sort of, when they had lost the municipalities, the attempt to think that they would work together, one would get this municipality, the other would get that one. And we're seeing more of that discussion emerge in this context, because I think the four areas of contention, KZN, Western Cape, Gauteng, and National, are opened up for potential coalitions. What is the panelists' view around that coalition and this idea that it's a national unity coalition, and whether or not that will actually bring what it's attempting to do? And 2 is, we've seen in the 30 years of democracy, we've not established a clear and coherent and very active civil society, or not civil society, that's been active, but the participation of this ordinary citizen with politics. how do we build that culture that is not being bastardized and become toxic by what the NC has done and its relationship with the ordinary person? Because I think a lot of the tensions we have now is that relation has been soured. So how do we fix that and build on that going forward? Thank you.
I think in the interest of time, what we'll do is just ask each panelist to kind of comment on the questions and give your perspective and round up in about 2 minutes each. That it's a bit tight, but we can try and do that. Lisa, you want to do this?
Yeah, I'll answer. Well, I'll comment on the question.
One more. Can I go?
Oh, okay, sorry.
No. Question, please. Sorry. Give the mic to the question.
It's fine. We have one more person after me.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay. Jazakallah Maulana for the time and everybody for attending, and the panelists as well. I've got just a few questions with regards to voting strategy. Heard what you guys have said. Fantastic information. But to help the voters, which is what I was hoping the strategy would do, and like many people said, it confused us some more. There is a need for an industrial revolution to happen here. The comments with regards to what was said about foreigners coming in and we assisting foreigners and being part in helping our neighbors is good. We understand that. But the general tradesman on the ground at the moment is looking at foreigners taking their jobs. And while academics can look at it as a boost for supporting our neighbors, the foreigners getting into and taking our jobs, that is what eats on the basic human rights of people in this country. We need to support, build our GDP, and grow that way. Okay. By allowing foreigners here, a simple basic idea you guys spoke of was, so far Maulana, you've asked about education, health, and security. But we haven't touched on development of the economy. No political party has touched on that. We haven't heard that. That's what we need. So economic development should be a crucial element in 30 years where we find failure on that level. So I'd like to pose a question to the panelists to revert back to which political party should we support to encourage economic development and humanity, the dignity of those that don't have, and we stop indigence from continuing with the handout from SASA. Thank you.
Shukran. Iqbal.
Assalamu alaikum, jazakallah to everybody. The panelists have essentially left my dilemma in paralysis. Everybody, I think, would like, or some people would like, to have been told who to vote for.
We can't do that.
And I don't think there is an answer. So the jury is out. I think what's important, because of the democratic system, each one has got the right and freedom to vote the way they want. So no matter who's going to tell them how to vote, their conscience is going to vote when they put the X on those ballot papers. What do we cherish the most is how we're going to speak to the vote. We need, as Muslims, we need to be just. We are commanded to be just and fair. I would look out for people that can answer that kind of a question. The history of the parties is one of betrayal. And everybody in that parliament, it happened on their watch, in one way or another. So sentiment, I think, is going to fly out of the window. Everybody is caught up with issues. They're going to look at an issue and vote accordingly. But I think there's a broader principle and a broader concern. And it has been touched in many ways comprehensively by all the panelists. So I might just be amplifying it. Is that the outcome, number one, needs to be respected. And when we respect the outcome, we have to make a so-called New Year's resolution, a post-election resolution, of what Ibrahim has referred to as correcting our own actions. There is a saying, a famous saying, as you are, so shall your leaders be over you. So, we have been complicit in the corruption. We can't point fingers. In one way or another, if we heard about it, we were silent at the dinner table, we were silent at the wedding table. That is complicity. What are we going to do about our roles in that? And then finally, the work of civil society starts only after the election. Whatever we do now is wait and see. So I think, and my wish, this is a nice little humorous thing I'm thinking of. Let me put out my wish list of what I want as a result of the election.
Yeah.
I'm hoping the three major parties collectively can get only up to 35%. That leaves the 65% to the rest. Nobody has touched on coalitions yet. And the party is only going to begin after elections. And we've seen how that has gone before the elections.
Right.
What are we as civil society going to do about it if it goes awry?
Okay.
Thank you.
Shukran. Okay, I think we'll come back to the panelists now for their responses and conclusions. Nomboniso?
I just wanted to respond to some of the points that Ifran raised. Firstly, on coalitions, I think that although our experiences of coalitions have been to see the instability, particularly in our cities, I don't think that we should despair around coalitions. All over the world, we have seen governments coming together during coalitions and sometimes collapsing. The key issue, though, would be why do parties come together? To develop some kind of principles and to develop some kind of common agenda. And the development of common agenda has not actually happened in many of our political parties, and often they come together and share the spoils. So I think if we talk about developing a clear platform, and then maybe you have negotiations around that, but I cannot see how, in this election and beyond, we can think of governance without thinking about coalitions. So my point is that even though we've not had such positive experiences often of coalitions, that we should not be shy from them, depending, of course, on what is it that informs with whom we come in those kinds of coalitions. And the second one is on how we have not created a clear and coherent civil society. I disagree. I think that we need to look beyond our own immediate experiences. In the last 30 years, actually, civil society has played critical roles in this country. If you think around AIDS, if you think around land, rural communities that have been at the forefront of some of the major rulings in the Constitutional Court that are core in the emerging constitutional jurisprudence. So I think we need to build on what exists and try and strengthen that.
Yeah.
The issue around, okay, that's all. Then others.
Angelo?
So I'm timing myself. Mechanisms of accountability, they exist, and we need to strengthen them. So there are mechanisms of accountability. There are public spaces that we can access in our legislatures at all three tiers of government, and there are processes we should be participating in and that we're already participating in. That said, we need more of those processes of accountability. Corporations and social media, absolutely. Corporations have influenced politics around the world all the time. Whether it is by direct funding of political candidates or whether it is, I will take my business out of this district if you don't do what I need you to do, and that happens across the world. I have a real anxiety that we have old habits that were learnt in a different country, and we haven't learnt the new habits that this country and this century requires. Everybody's saying, tell me how to vote. Why do we need a strong man? Why do we need a deputy principal to tell us what to do? We and the media and all sorts of conversations you have with your family and friends are giving you information that will inform your decision, but the decision must eventually be yours. If you want somebody else to tell you how to vote, then you have misunderstood democracy fundamentally, which means you are constantly going to be enthralled to other people who then pretend to be an expert telling you how to behave. And that is not what a democracy is. What makes corruptibility possible is a crucial component that we need to investigate. Coalitions have become trading posts, not policy coherence. And so when those politicians come back to us, whatever happens after 29 May, whatever our behavior has been in relation to the state so far, we will now have to struggle much harder to make sure that they do what they're required to do, that we change the system to our advantage. And for some of us who are old enough, it is unacceptably costly that we've got to do this twice in one lifetime. We had to do it in the 80s, we now have to do it. But option B is not, there's no other option. And lastly, in terms of voting strategy, you need to take the information available to you and make an informed decision and talk to people. Don't just wait for somebody to tell you how to vote. In terms of economic development policy, obviously we didn't focus on that tonight, but it informs all of the discussions we've had. And then the last thing that I think we also need to do is we all have individual experiences, whether it is of others, of joblessness, of not getting a job, of not being able to trade, and place those individual experiences in a larger context to see if it holds a pattern. Because my experience might be exceptional from a pattern. And that is, I think, a crucial thing to do ahead of these elections. That not to just vote on emotion based on individual experience, because what we're trying to generate is a society in which we can all self-actualize. And that, for me, is something that is an ethical component of, does the party see me as fully human? Because if others can be bombed and I can be silent, when is it going to be my turn to be bombed and I'll want somebody to stand up for me and there'll be nobody?
Kanita?
I am fully covered by Angelo. Just to 3 points very quickly. Social media, please be aware about what your role in misinformation and disinformation. Secondly, I think that this conversation tonight was very, hopefully, it was empowering in making you make your own individual decision. The politics is personal, and what's personal to you may not be personal to me. For a lady in Khayelitsha, the 370 Rand grant is the lens in which she looks at the world. The lawyer in Sea Point, the fact that his refuse gets collected and lives in a posh area is the lens in which he looks to the world. So the politics is personal. We can't all live and see the world through one lens. And thirdly, devise your own accountability plan. After May 29, when I vote, what are the areas in which I'm going to take an active participation role? Whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it is feeding children, whatever, or going and protesting outside the city of Joburg, whatever it may be. What's my own accountability plan for myself, and link that to the ideal of the South African political landscape in which you hope for.
Ibrahim?
All my colleagues to my left, ideologically speaking, have covered sort of almost everything. And very eloquently. Let's just face it. You guys want us to tell you how to vote. If that was the case, I would have stood for election. And I'm not standing for election this time round. Maybe in future, inshallah. So I'm not telling you how to vote, but I can tell you what to think about when you go to vote. So the first thing, and to end where we began, 3 ballots. It's the first opportunity in which you can balance being a values voter with being a strategic voter. So guess what? You can split your vote. Yep. You don't have to vote on the same ballot for the same party, and you don't have to vote for the same party or the same candidate across all the ballots. The IEC, just as a rule of thumb, that doesn't mean you must abuse this, understands that this is a complicated process. even though it sounds simple, and they're giving people up to 2 or 3 chances if you spoil your ballot and you think you have to get a new one. Please don't abuse it, but there will be an opportunity up to 2 or 3 times to get a new ballot. Don't try to crook the system by stuffing your one ballot in a ballot box and try and vote again. No, you've got to join the queue again. You have to join the queue. So that it will prolong voting and so on. So if you really want to know, a friend of mine in Cape Town has a really simple matrix for how he or she is going to split their vote. Let's call them it. So they believe that a specific party, which is social democratic in outlook, somewhat left on the spectrum, has a solid position on Palestine, is getting their national vote because they believe in this, they identify themselves. Their class interests in the Western Cape are being propounded by the current governing party in the Western Cape. And they have no qualms about thinking that my class interests are being protected by these people and I will vote for them because I enjoy my life and I'd like to keep it that way. And their third vote is going to go to an independent candidate who everyone knows, Zaki Ahmed, and he's tossing it up, and I'm not campaigning for anyone, and he's tossing it up with the new entrants like Raizim Zansi. Irfan, you'll be happy to hear. So that's a consideration. Now, there's a way in which you can be strategic in voting, in splitting your vote if you want. If, however, you believe, I'm a values voter, then hey, go ahead. And if you really want to take a stand on Palestine, this has nothing to do with the election, then stop buying German cars and stop buying all their stuff and let's manufacture and make our own. And one last thing. If you want to evaluate the party, including new parties, parties do 3 things. They represent, they conduct oversight and demand accountability, and they pass policy and law. If you think about the representative function, what ideas do parties have? Are those ideas according with my values? What constituencies in societies do those parties represent? Labor, business, blacks, whites? What's their stance on fundamental freedoms? Those are the ideas, right? In terms of constituency, who do they represent? Labor, business, a mix, right? How have they behaved when it comes to institutions? Did they conduct? Were they vigilant in oversight, or were they not? Were they answerable when they had to be answerable, or were they not? And lastly, what is the range and depth of their policies? So there's an evaluation matrix. No one can tell you how to vote. You're a thinking individual, a feeling individual, and a feeling person. So think for yourself.
I think on that note, we'll conclude by saying, and I appreciate the sentiment where people say that they're a bit more confused, but I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes you just need to become a little bit more confused before you get the eventual clarity. It's making you think. It's a process. So you may have come in with a very simplistic approach, and our panelists have put before you a number of issues that will make you think. So the listeners out there, the viewers out there, the podcast will be up, the recordings will be up. Listen to it again, watch it again, try and process it and digest it so that it helps you to come to that particular conclusion. Let me take the opportunity to thank Mohammed Kaji and the team at ASRI for helping quite significantly in putting this program together. Nomboniso, Angelo, Kanita and Ibrahim for your time and for your input. We really appreciate it. All the media partners here, Radio Ansar coming all the way down from Durban. And we've got INX Prime as well as Hilal TV, all the Radio Islam staff in the background who helped to put this together. And everybody who came here out this evening to be part of the discussion. Shukran, we really appreciate it. Good evening and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.